If you have a person and their effective hourly rate, especially if you factor in opportunity cost, is something like $200 an hour, and if the EA is $18 an hour, any amount of time that executive is spending doing things that could be done by an EA is just a straight loss for the organization.
Hello, fellow data nerds. My guest today is Sam Corcos. Sam is the co-founder and CEO of Levels, a health monitoring startup. Sam, welcome to World of DaaS.
Good to be here.
I'm really excited. Now, we're going to get into some of the health stuff in a bit, but Levels kind of operates in a bunch of very unusual ways. And I'd love to kind of talk about it first. You're building in public, you're remote, you're asynchronous first, and one of the things that sets Levels apart is the way you use like virtual assistants. Like, let's dive into that. I've got a bunch of other questions, but how do you use virtual assistants at Levels?
We leverage VAs a lot. I would say about half the people on our team, maybe more, have access to an EA, and they're able to get a lot of leverage on their time. I'd say a big category of work that EAs do is they help with things like reporting, accountability. They often do first drafts of things. It's a source of labor that is less expensive and really just gets more leverage out of every person on your team. So we have an EA pool where if you don't have enough work for a dedicated person, you can hand off tasks to this pool of available talent. And then at some point, if you have enough work, you get a dedicated EA.
And so like maybe that EA first just supports, let's say, like the whole sales team. And then maybe it works with like an individual salesperson or something.
Yeah, if at some point they end up with enough work or there's enough context necessary for them to work effectively together, then we just dedicate one specific EA to them. I think we have about 20 EAs that we work with, and I think 5 of them are in the general pool, and the rest of them are dedicated. I think I personally have 3 or 4 fully dedicated just to my tasks. So as more of these tasks build up, we add more resources to it.
And presumably, like that EA is working, let's say, 40 hours a week. So you've got like 90 to 120 hours a week of things you need help with. Like, what are some maybe non-obvious examples of things like you use EAs for?
Yeah, I think the one broad category that I have found is really helpful is this is maybe a bit of an esoteric explanation, but I find that working with EAs is really helpful in entropy management within an organization, which is as organizations get larger, as communication pathways get more complex and diffuse, it's really hard to keep track of whether processes are being followed, whether things are getting done effectively and consistently, whether balls are getting dropped. And I found that using EAs to monitor things, send me reports, so that I don't have to. These tend to be things that I either was doing in the past or I just wouldn't have capacity to do if I didn't have EAs. So they really help with that. I would say other things
they
do.
Go to Jira and do, look at this thing and see if this was checked in or this was and then let me know if it's not, or send an email to the person on my behalf asking for a status or something.
It's exactly right.
Okay. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, it's exactly something like that.
Or go and jump into Salesforce and review this, and if the report it's not in this band, like I want to know about, like that type of thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, like another.
Some of those things you would think you could automate, though, right? You would think you could set up like a Jira alert or Salesforce alert or something, right?
You would hope so. I would say in a lot of ways they fill in the gaps of bad APIs, where if you just don't have software that can do this. I would say some of them, the software can get you 90% of the way there. So a recent example from yesterday, I got my monthly report on the status of our engineering documentation. And in Notion, there's a new thing that they added somewhat recently called validation, where you validate that it is still up to date. And I think once a month, my EAs go through and they check all of our engineering documentation, and everyone on the Eng team agrees that it's good to have up-to-date documentation and that we should maintain that standard. and they
And
went
this is
through.
internal, like an internal docs.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. That's right. And oftentimes, all you have to do is look at it and say, yep, this is still valid. This is still up to date. And you check it off. And so they went through and they checked and they noticed that quite a number of documents were out of date. There's an owner associated with those docs. And they said, hey, so and so, it's time to review this document. And they might even go as far as to like block time on their schedule to review it, just so that they know that they have capacity to do it. So it's just making sure that we're keeping track of these things and we don't drop balls. They tend to be really good for things like that, but there's lots of other stuff we use them for.
So let's say you have like internal, like most of these, you have internal documentation, which could be like engineering, or it could just be like HR, like your internal 409A share price or something like that. You might want to keep up to date. How's it work? Like on Notion, you have an owner like from the company who's supposed to, and then like the last updated thing. Like how does that work?
Yeah, that's exactly right. There's a field in Notion wikis called validation, and you say like needs to be validated every 90 days, every 120 days, whatever the cadence is. And then people go through and you just check and make sure that it was up to date. And every document has an owner. And so when people transition out of the company, you transfer ownership to somebody who's still at the company.
And is that easy to do? Do you have to like find and replace everything, or is it just like a simple kind of transition?
It's pretty simple. I mean, I don't know if you can do like a bulk replace, but I guess, people tend not to own that many documents. And I'd say one of the most common things that happens during these review periods is people deprecate documents and this document's no longer relevant and you close it out. So that's another big part of the process, because as anyone knows who's worked even an organization that's even, 12 people, pretty quickly you end up with a lot more documentation that is just out of date, and the documentation loses relevance and value because it's really hard to know what's even still being used.
Yeah, if you're not updating it every month, like then it may not have any real value or anything like that.
Yep. And they do things like I have found that it's really useful to send context a couple days before any call that I have. So my EAs will send our latest investor update, maybe some podcasts that I've done, more information about me, about the company, so that people can come into the conversation with a little bit more information than they otherwise would have. I would say probably the biggest time saver for me, which also improves productivity, is I have a Notion doc every day that has pages for each of my calls, and they do pre-call notes. So they find the person on LinkedIn, they provide their background, they have a screenshot of the email or whatever communication method we had, so that I can come into the call and it's like, John Smith, who is John Smith? And I can see, contacted me on email. Here was what we talked about. Here's the nature of the call. Here's more information about them. And then some follow-up items at the bottom. And they sometimes can even do those follow-ups themselves. So it really helps me just quickly understand who they are, develop context, and also not drop balls.
And is that done is that done like 2 days before, so that like one day before you can review it or something? And then you get like an email from them being like, oh, it's ready for you to review. Like, here's the links, or how do you know when to review it?
So I just have a page, Sam's calls, and I just know to review it. And the answer is,
and it just links out to each thing or something, because like, let's say you have a call with Auren, like we may have had many calls in the past or something, and you may want to have like an Auren page, so it links to the Auren page.
It wouldn't link to the Auren page, but it would link to the specific page for the call that we had that day. And that page will eventually go into our meeting notes database. And so you could potentially link it to other related calls. What it ends up being useful for is when you have back-to-back calls and you're shifting context all the time, it's really hard to know. There have been a few calls before we had this process where I would have a call with somebody named Matt. And there's a lot of people named Matt. And then I would get 5 minutes into the conversation and realize I was talking to a completely different Matt than I thought I was talking to. So having this sort of process really helps with that.
Yeah, like in the Zoom world, for sure. Like we've all had those types of things. Okay, that's interesting. Like what else? Like, I mean, I think people are interested, like, because I think even people who have like a full-time EA in person, like may not even know how to use that person effectively whether it's because whether it's a virtual EA or an in-person EA or whatever. Like, how else can one use EAs effectively? Is there like a guidebook? Like, hey, here's how you use EAs. Like, I don't think that's like something you learn in business school or something.
Yeah, wait. Yeah, I wrote an article in First Round Review that might be helpful to add to the show notes of some concepts on how to effectively work with EAs. I think one of the conceptual things is really think through all of the things that just suck your energy throughout the day and figure out a way to offload those to somebody else. I would say first decide whether that thing needs to be done at all. The answer is often no. People just do things out of inertia because they've been doing it for a while. And eventually you get to a point where you keep pushing it. I would say a really good indicator of this is if you have something on your calendar that you're supposed to do, but you find that you keep moving it to tomorrow, and you've been doing that for 2 or 3 weeks, that's probably a thing you should figure out how to delegate, because it's clear that it's not something that you enjoy doing. For me, it's things like managing LinkedIn DMs or Twitter DMs or all these different communication tools that I have that I just don't have the capacity to stay on top of. But more than that, for Twitter,
do you get a lot of LinkedIn DMs and Twitter DMs? Like, I get extremely few.
Yeah, I get quite a lot of them.
Okay.
I would say that the quality of the ones that I get is very low, but every once in a while I get one that is really valuable. So this is similarly with email, filtering out email. At this point, my EAs have enough context on what is relevant for what I need to do.
So they're like triaging your inbox and stuff like that. Okay.
Yep. So that's another one that they do that's pretty effective.
And are they like moving something to another folder for you and you just review that folder, but you don't review like the actual inbox, or how does it work?
Yeah, that's right. There's a label, which is just internally, it's just not important is what the label is. And they just tag things with that and it gets put to a different folder. And I basically never look at it at this point, but early on I would check it and see every once in a while there's something that would get
So
missed.
if it's in the inbox, it's not like they flag what's important, they more like flag what should get out of the inbox or something.
Yeah, and it's possible that the better strategy is the other way around, of like flagging as important. Filtering email is one of those things that I still don't feel like I've solved from an internal communications perspective. It's just such a lossy system that figuring out how to solve that is hard.
I imagine that there's a Notion doc for this admin owns about how to run this process, and they have to keep that up to date every month or something.
That's right. And what's interesting about it is, especially in the way that we do it, is we use Loom pretty religiously. And for those not familiar, it's a screen recording tool.
Yeah.
And all of the time that they spend filtering out email, they are recording on Loom. And then they post it on the process doc page. So if a new EA comes and wants to figure out how does this work, they can actually watch every single time every person has ever done this task. And they can just learn by repetition, just by watching how other people do it and pattern match. I think when it comes to working with EAs, almost everybody I've talked to dramatically overestimates the complexity of the tasks that they're doing. If you can just watch a Loom of somebody doing a task a handful of times, most people are able to replicate that task with 90+% accuracy with very, very little context beyond just seeing what they were doing.
And is there some sort of like, obviously with your emails, you might get very, very confidential things that are in there. Are you somehow shading those confidential things out or editing those things out in Loom, or you're just not worrying about
it? I think to some degree, the answer is just not worrying about it. I think that there are things that are actually confidential, and there are things that people assume are confidential. A lot of this depends on the culture of the company. We're pretty aggressive in the degree of transparency that we have, and so the only thing that we really consider confidential, other than the obvious ones like ongoing legal cases, the only thing that we have that is just consistently confidential is compensation. Things like individual performance, almost anything else is something that we share with the broader company. So we're pretty open about it internally.
And I noticed you recently made a change where before individual performance was deemed confidential. Now, the default is that it's open. Maybe there's like specific items there, like if someone's having a specific personal problem that remains confidential.
Yeah,
like,
that's right.
Why did you make that shift?
Well, so a few years ago, we, by we, I really just mean me, wanted to be more open with how we run our business. And by open, I mean both internally and externally to different degrees. For example, we share all of our investor updates. We share all of our weekly all hands publicly. They're posted on our YouTube
Including
channel.
like revenues and stuff and expenses. Oh, wow.
Yep. Revenue, expenses, all of that stuff is public on our website down in the footer. Every investor update since literally the first day of the company is available. And you can see what our revenues were in month one. And we publish those 1 year after a 1 year time delay.
Got it. Okay. Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. The main reason is just that we realize that there are certain pending items in our investor updates that are probably ill-advised to make public while they're pending, but tends not to be the case after a year.
Got it. So, like we're working on this top secret product, and then 6 months later the product comes out, or it didn't work, or whatever. Then it's okay for people to know about it.
Yeah, that's right. So internally, this is one of the important things that I think is important for every company. We have 5 co-founders at Levels, and I've been through this before of starting companies, being a co-founder, and something that I've made this mistake before in the past is not being super clear what it means to be the CEO of the company. And for every co-founder that we brought on, I was very explicit that no matter how many co-founders we have one CEO. And so if everybody else believes one thing and I believe another thing, we're doing the thing that I say, because that's how it has to be in order for this to work. This is not a democracy. And so the shift to this level of transparency was one of those things where I really just had to push it through. And I would say some people were neutral, some people were strongly against it, but everyone was willing to disagree and commit and feel it out. And what we found is that the level of transparency internally was really helpful in terms of building trust within the company, because people knew that what we were saying was truthful. We weren't hiding things from people. And sharing them externally also built a lot of trust with our customers, because one of our goals is to become a major trust provider within healthcare. It's a category that is really lacking in trust. And so when people can see that we're super open, we're honest with everything that we say, it builds trust with your customers. So that's been another one. It also builds trust with potential recruits and employees. It's been a major source of value for hiring. And so maybe to answer your specific question, this transition that we made maybe 6 months ago, which was we used to exclude individual performance and compensation, and now it's just compensation. All individual performance, including one-on-ones, are default shared. It doesn't mean they're mandatory shared, but by default, they will get shared unless you say not to share a specific recording. The shift really came from recognizing that so many of the things that we want to do as a company and the level of openness and trust that we had built was really incompatible with hiding individual performance, where it felt like people out of the blue would lose their jobs for performance reasons. And people would say, I really wish I knew, because I totally could have helped them on that issue.
Yeah.
And it requires a super high level of trust to have a conversation in a one-on-one where I say, Auren, right now, we often use the Keeper test from Netflix. You know that one?
Explain it.
Yeah, it's a really good heuristic for uh, just working from like the space of feeling. The keeper test is you close your eyes and you imagine this person is sitting across from you. Let's say you have an employee named Mike, and Mike comes to you and says, "Auren, I have bad news. I I decided that this is not the place for me anymore, and I just accepted a job at Google." And then you reflect on how you feel, and if you feel relief or excitement that they're leaving, that is a bad sign.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
keeper test is you should feel terror. You should feel like, oh man, we really need this person. I would fight really hard to keep them here. And if you feel anything other than that, they need to know that immediately. And you need to figure out how to get to the point where you're excited for them to continue working there. And so we've had times where I've said to people in one on ones, you do not currently pass my keeper test. This doesn't mean that we're firing you right now, but it does mean that unless we figure out how to get to a point where I'm confident that you're adding value and that I'm happy for you to be here, ultimately this is not going to work out. And that meeting gets shared to the whole company. And then people often jump in and say, "Hey, I can help with this thing. I can help with that
Yeah.
thing." It really
Yeah.
requires a super high level of trust, and it's a bit of a leap of faith.
And it could be that doesn't pass the manager's keeper test, but there's many other people in the organization that would go nuts if this person left because they are actually valued. Maybe the manager doesn't see that, and maybe that could be
Totally.
helpful if other people let them know.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, and it requires a certain culture and a level of trust within an organization. And so this is definitely not something that I recommend everyone try, but it's been working for us because we set that expectation from day one.
Now, because you're so transparent, I'm sure at some point you guys had a big internal debate about whether you make compensation public, and you've decided not to make that public. Like, how did that go down? Because I could see every argument you make just going the same way there. Because I assume compensation is like very reflective of like how someone's performing, and if you know rank ordered the compensation in the company, it would very if you include stock, would probably very clearly match the value that that person is to the company, right?
Yeah, it's very possible that we end up at some point making compensation public, but it's one of those interesting things where I there are some case studies, Bridgewater being one of the obvious ones, where increasing transparency, visibility across meetings, performance, all of these things have added a lot of value to the culture. Bridgewater does not share compensation data. In fact, almost no company that does this shares compensation data. There are a handful of examples of companies that do, and the people that I've talked to at those companies have said it was terrible. And so I don't have really any positive data points that come from sharing compensation data other than if you should make compensation data shared within the company or public, it just becomes a constant source of tension of like, why does he make $5,000 more than me? I think I'm better than him. And
Yeah.
it becomes a huge distraction from the actual work that needs to get done. So um, it's possible we end up there, but there would have to be a reason to do it beyond just in principle, we want to share everything.
Okay. Yeah, got it. I could see how I could see how all these things would cause a lot of angst and stuff
Sure.
like that. Even like, why does this person get a better performance review than me or something?
Right.
So, but yeah, but I agree when it comes to pocketbook issues, it's even more so. Now, going back to like the assistants, like most people don't know how to manage assistants. Like, how do you train your staff to manage them?
I think part of the answer is working with an agency really helps with that because they do most of the training themselves. So
Hmm.
we work with Athena. They're an agency out of the Philippines, and they're on the more expensive side, but they also do most of the training themselves. They do the cybersecurity training. They uh, they teach people how to be. They teach the EAs how to be more proactive, so that you don't have to teach them how to do it yourself.
Hmm.
The We also have an internal program where uh, we've had a couple people lead this internally at different points in time of the internal delegation program. this is another one of those entropy management things where I get I get a monthly report on how many delegations somebody has done with an EA. And if we
And
notice
sorry,
that some,
and the Athena provide you that, or how do you? Is that
yeah,
just something they do by default, or how does that work?
no, we ask them to do it. And the main reason is that the math is pretty simple in terms of how much leverage you can get from your EAs. If you have a person and their effective hourly rate, especially if you factor in opportunity cost, is something like $200 an hour, and if the EA is $18 an hour, any amount of time that executive is spending doing things that could be done by an EA is just a straight loss for the organization.
Yeah.
And so if I notice a trend, like an executive on the team has 0 delegations several months in a row, it is extremely improbable that they have no tasks that should be handed off to an EA. And so oftentimes what we'll do is we'll find somebody on our team. Right now, I think it's Zach who runs legal for us. He's a really good delegator. And we just have him spend some time with whoever that person is. And we say, let's go through your day to day. Let's figure out what your tasks are. And then we try to increase their awareness of how to delegate. Most people just don't even know where to get started. And so it takes a lot of practice.
Okay. Interesting. And what the in some cases, like people might use like upworkers for very specific thing. I use this person for this, but of course, like getting someone up to speed takes a lot of time.
Mm-hmm.
And so the good news about using upworkers, are very, very specific about this thing. They know how to like do this type of thing on Google Sheets, or make this type of zap on Zapier or something like that. But what you're saying is there's also something about like having a long-term relationship with somebody where they get to know you, and they might not be an expert in any one thing, but they can like slowly take on things over time.
That's right. Yeah, and the more context they have, the less specific instructions you have to give. You can be more declarative and less imperative. So, for example, we did something recently which was kind of fun. In fact, I have them right here. We I stole this from one of our investors, Wiz, where I made magic cards for every person on our team.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, and there's like a custom flavor text based on an interview that they did internally. We take images of them, we put those through Midjourney to use their face, and then like turn them into a wizard. And it was very cool. And it took me about 15 minutes to define that entire task. I explained where to get the data, how to
Now,
use
why would you even do that anyway? Like, why wasn't that someone else in the company? Like, why is the CEO getting like even like assigning that task or something?
Yeah, so I think part of the answer is I had the idea.
You just wanted to do it. You're like, oh,
I
this
thought
would
it
be
was
fun.
yeah, it'd be fun. Exactly. And in any other world, I would have probably had to say, all right, if I actually want this to get done, I have to schedule a meeting with somebody on our team
Yeah.
who is not an EA, and then I have to teach them how to do it, and then they have to figure out how to do it, and maybe bring on. It would have been a huge time suck, and basically the answer is it just wouldn't have gotten done because
Yeah.
it would have been so much effort and so much cost. But instead, it took me about 15 minutes. It took the EA a couple days. They followed the task. They had enough context to know where all the information was and what my intent was, and they were able to do it pretty quickly and get it turned around.
Now, some of the tasks that you have need to be done like very real time, and maybe during like U.S. business hours. Some of them could be done like async, or maybe even there's a benefit for them being done over the nighttime. I know like most of the virtual assistants that you use are in the Philippines. So do some work U.S. hours and some work Philippines hours? How does it work?
Yeah, so they work different schedules. My recommendation for anyone doing this has always been try to have some synchronous overlap. So uh, I think the EAs that my primary EAs have, I think they overlap with me until about 1 p.m.
Okay.
I think they're synchronous until about 1 p.m. And then there's a couple others that are maybe fully asynchronous.
Yep.
Because when they need access to a two-factor authentication key, if they're always in a different time zone, trying to coordinate that is a huge pain.
Yeah.
So having some amount of overlap is way better than having none.
And are they is it somehow like, are they coordinating with each other? Is there like one email address that like, and somehow they are all and like can kind of read that, or how does it work?
Yeah. So some of them is the EA pool is done through a Google group that we set up
Yeah.
where everyone in the EA pool is part of that, and you can just
Is
send.
that something you figured out, or is that something like Athena's like suggested for you?
That's something that we figured out. I don't know how common the EA pool concept
Hmm.
is, but it's definitely something that we make a lot of use of. The other is we try to have, when individuals, in my case, I have 3 or 4, we try to have a primary EA who quarterbacks these things.
Hmm.
So they do a little bit of the load balancing, and they also know what skills each of the EAs have. And so they can quarterback who the right person is to do each task.
Okay, got it. That makes sense. Um, and um, I would imagine that like one thing that EAs can or can do an amazing job of is things for personal things, not just things like at your business like levels, but things
Hmm.
personal. Like, how do you use them for like the personal stuff?
Yeah, it depends a lot on whether the EA is in person or whether the EA is remote.
Yeah.
Uh, for
Well, even if they're remote, I'm sure they can like someone and pick up things and do right.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, for sure. I would say for personal stuff, this is sort of we'll call it work adjacent as an example for something they
yeah,
do for me is they keep track of my calendar and they categorize each task and they send me a report on what my priorities were for that month. And so this is time management. It's somewhat personal, but also related to work. And that just gives me a feedback loop on whether I'm actually spending my time on the things that I state are my priorities, which is really helpful. There's an accountability loop there. Um, they can do things like help you with your taxes if it's something that's really taking up a lot of your time.
like getting all the things in one place, or
Yep.
finding all the stuff, or categorizing things, or that type of thing. Okay.
Yeah, and there's we've had a lot of internal conversations about this. There's there's admittedly a gray area on what is or is not reasonable to use a work EA for in terms of personal tasks.
Yeah.
Um, the obvious, obviously useful and like clearly acceptable category is you need help delivering something that adds value to work right now.
Yeah.
Makes total sense. An obvious no is you have a side hustle and you're using your work EA to do a thing that generates you income completely unrelated to what you do for
Yes.
work.
Yep.
But then there's all this middle stuff,
Yeah.
which is like,
Or it
hey,
could save you time, and that's time could be dedicated to work, right?
exactly. It's like, hey, can you help me plan my vacation? It's like, is that? It's like, well, kind of.
Yeah.
Because it would have taken me 3 hours and I would have otherwise been working during that time.
Yeah.
So it's very much a gray area, and you have to. We just ask people to use their judgment. Ultimately, is if you would otherwise be working during that time, then by all
Great.
means use an EA.
Right. If they save you, and if they get you 2 hours more of work, well, I mean, that's that's huge.
Yeah, totally. So we ask people to use their judgment. Part of it is because we have such a good accountability structure around keeping track of all the tasks. Some people, I wish I could remember which company does this, but the one of the companies, they had an issue with people expensing things that were personal to their work cards. And their solution, instead of like creating more and more policies, which they'd been
Mhm.
doing for a long time and didn't seem to solve anything, they just put every expense gets posted publicly in a Slack channel.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and that's the only change that they made. And
Yeah.
like basically what they ended up creating was a system that if you would ultimately be embarrassed by people seeing what you just expensed on the company card,
Yeah.
then you probably shouldn't do it.
God, so it's like Mike spent like $10,000 on a plane ticket. Okay, maybe
Yeah.
shouldn't have done that, or something like that.
Yeah, it's like an extreme outlier of like, that's interesting. Everyone else is like $300 and then Mike was $10,000. I wonder why that is.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That's really Now, you guys are also just generally very async, right? You try to. I'm sure you have some meetings and some synchronous stuff, but you try to do everything async. Like, how does that? Because I think a lot of companies wish they did that. Like, how does that work?
Yeah, async is a really it's really good for certain types of tasks. It's less good for other types of tasks. I think the answer is that ultimately it's a trade-off. And so understanding, I would say that remote and async are really closely tied together in a way that I don't think everyone fully appreciates. Uh,
Even if you have everyone in the same time zone remote, you're
mhm.
saying it has to be like more async is really important. Okay.
Yeah, remote and async are really, they're almost synonymous. And if you have one without the other, it's really challenging. So it is it's not ideal to sit in meetings all day in person, but you can get energy from those. If you're working with people, you feel the energy in the room,
Yeah.
you get the body language. There is nothing more soul crushing than sitting in Zoom calls all day. It's just not the same. Like you
Yeah.
can't do. I've
100%
tried.
agree. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you lean into the worst parts of remote, which is you're not physically co-located and you don't get energy from other people, and you insist on keeping the same structure of synchronous meetings, your productivity is going to go down, your energy is going to go down, output's going to decrease. If you can lean into the fact that every meeting that you have is ultimately content, like if we were having a Zoom call right now, this would just be content if we
Yeah.
recorded it. You can record a Loom and you can send a video to somebody asynchronously. I think most of our engineers, just looking at their schedules, have something like 3 meetings per week. And so it depends a lot on the role as well.
Yeah.
So
Obviously, if
some
you're a
roles,
salesperson, you're having external, but you don't need to have a lot of internal meetings.
that's exactly right. And so it really works better for certain types of roles and certain types of companies as well, depending on what it is that they're doing. So yeah, async is it's really valuable in certain aspects. There's I steal this quote from Matt Mullenweg from WordPress. He says you should be as async as possible, but not more.
Yeah.
And I think
Okay.
that's where people often miss on some of these things is they assume only async is the answer, but the reality is that there is a time and place for co-located, for high bandwidth, low latency communication to get that level of alignment
Yeah.
that's
Let's just get
necessary.
on the. Sometimes it's like, okay, let's just get on the phone and talk for a couple of minutes or something like that synchronously.
Totally.
What is there a uh is there some sort of template you have for meetings, like the meetings that have to happen synchronously? Is there, I assume there's some sort of async buildup of the template of the agenda of like do you have does everyone who follows like a synchronous meeting use the same template in the organization?
Broadly speaking, the answer is no. There are certain meetings that are more formulaic, like our Friday forums, the team all hands.
Yeah.
It follows a routine, which is we announce at the beginning of the meeting, this is where we celebrate our wins. We have Monday metrics where we present all of our business metrics, we dig into them a little bit more. We do a lot of our projects, we do these kickoff meetings where we bring everyone who's working on a project together synchronously to just formalize like this project is
But like the
starting
Friday,
now.
you just this Friday meeting you have, like why
Hmm.
does everyone have to be on it live?
So we've tried doing it async. So we've experimented with a lot of these things. The
Yeah.
reality is just that there it is the intent of the meeting is to celebrate wins for the week, and what we discovered trying doing it async for several months is that the whole point of the meeting, which is to have bring energy of
Yeah,
like
like
positivity.
clapping everyone. Okay. Yeah.
Hmm.
Okay.
It falls completely flat when it's async. So we realize that meeting has to be synchronous, and we try to get as many people to go as
Now, if it's
possible.
synchronous, does that mean like most of your employees are in the
Hmm.
US?
um Most of our employees are in the US. This is another piece of feedback. I wish I could remember who specifically gave us this feedback, but it's somebody who runs a much larger remote company. And we asked them, if you could do it all over, and you were our size, what would you do differently? And they said, we would have set clear time zone expectations no matter where you live.
Mhm.
Because where they ended up is they effectively run three different companies that have different meeting schedules that are
Yeah.
completely independent. They have Asia, Europe, and the US. And they
Yeah.
have to coordinate these as three separate entities. And they said, if I could do it again, I would say, no matter where you live, you have to be available in America's time zones, which is basically California to Brazil. So if we need to schedule a meeting as a team, that's the time zone we're scheduling it.
Mhm.
And if that means you have to stay up late or wake up early, that's up to you. That's a
Or
choice
like
that you
there's
can
some
make.
core hours, let's say
Exactly.
9 a.m. Pacific to 1 p.m. Pacific or something
Hmm.
like that.
That's exactly right. I think that those are the actual core hours that we have is 9 a.m. Pacific to 1. It might even be 8 a.m. Pacific, but yeah.
Okay. All right. That makes sense. Um, or are there other uh the fact that you guys are so public and so open, are there some like downsides that you've had to kind of work through?
There are a lot of, um, we'll call them theoretical downsides. There are a lot of risks that people perceive. I will say that I have not, I don't think that we've experienced any real, like, tangible downsides other than people are concerned that something might happen in the future. There were
Yeah.
definitely some, investors that opted out of the process going forward. One of them accused us of negligence for sharing all of this information, but like it's more of a philosophical difference, I think.
One of the things, like, I can imagine from like HR related things or something, like, okay, you might be doing a training or not doing a training or something like that. Like, I could see how those things could end up being like both positive and a negative or something.
Totally, it's HR, legal, those sorts of things. They
Yeah.
especially when it comes to sharing all of our one-on-ones within the entire company and having everything recorded. There were a lot of people in legal who like their hair is falling out just hearing that that's something that we do. But the reality is that it builds trust. It also it makes it a lot harder for people to create false accusations because if you if you say X and Y happened in this specific meeting, we have the recording of that meeting.
Yeah.
Like we know whether it happened or not. And so I think what people would be
And and,
surprised.
and most, how do you record? Are you recording it on Gong or
It's
Zoom
on
or
Zoom.
something? Okay, so
Yeah,
you
there's
just use
just
like the cloud recording on Zoom and just keep it, and
that's right.
then and then
Hmm.
and then it's just easy to search through it, or you're having some sort of, the Zoom AI is writing like the notes on it.
So yeah, there's just a toggle at the organization level of default record on Zoom.
Yeah,
And so
yeah,
we just turn that on. And it's worth noting that this is not a suicide pact. So we're not saying all meetings must be recorded and all meetings must be shared. We've just changed the default behavior, which is unless you say otherwise, or unless you turn off the recording, just by default, all these things will be shared. And the we Loom integrates with Zoom. Sometimes it's hard to get these names correct because they sound so
yeah.
similar. But you can port all of your Zoom meetings into Loom, and then you can share the embeds and other things through Loom. So that tends to be the strategy that we use. But there's lots of ways you can do it.
Okay, I didn't realize that. So you can port the Zoom meetings into Loom, and
Yep.
then because it's easier to share, or you can share
Hmm.
clips easier or something like that. And
That's right.
the Loom AI UI is easier for that.
Yep. That's right.
All right, now getting to levels, because I love your company. We haven't really talked, but so we've talked a lot about on World of Das about data used for health. And obviously, you're tracking things like glucose and other types of things. I personally find like tracking some of this data for my own health like a bit overwhelming. And I get a bunch of blood tests and stuff. And sometimes I don't even know like what I'm really supposed to be looking at. Like,
Yep.
what do you, outside of blood sugar, like, what do you track personally?
So this is an interesting challenge. What we've learned over the course of building this company is that we measure almost nothing in our bodies. When you compare it to any sort of mechanical system or a software system,
Yep.
There are 50,000 sensors on every Falcon 9 rocket that goes to space. If you wore every commercially available sensor known to man in terms of what's a consumer sensor, you're really just measuring blood sugar, which is the only molecule that we can measure in real time, heart
Yep.
rate, skin temperature, and you're using a gyro to measure your movement. And
Yep.
that's about it. And so 3 of those are superficial, literally, like they're outside of the skin. And 1 of those is a molecule. And there are tens of thousands of molecules in your body that you'd like to be able to measure. So I try to keep track of things like blood sugar is a really useful one because for me, it's really been more lifestyle driven rather than health driven. Of why do I have brain fog in the middle of the day? It's often because of something that I ate.
Yep.
Things like movement is a really important one. Uh, I although I work at levels and this is a health company, I'm not a super optimizer. I'm not a biohacker. I'm really looking for the 80-20 of how do I not die a premature death and how do I maintain energy levels throughout the day. So some amount of movement is really important. Some amount of weight training is really important. So I try to
I
keep
think you
track of
mentioned
how much.
like after you maybe eat a lunch, you just take a walk around the block or something like that.
Totally. Yeah, even like a 20-30 minute walk has a really large measurable impact on how your body
So if
responds
you're
to
doing
food.
like a call, you'll try to do a walk while you do the call or something.
Yep,
Okay.
exactly. hmm Yeah. So protein is another one. Almost everybody does not get enough protein throughout the day. So keeping track
What
of how
does
much
protein
protein you're
do for
getting.
you?
So some of it is uh, as
Because sometimes I've
this
seen this
is
thing of like the amount of protein I'm supposed to eat, and it's like I
yeah,
could
I
never
know.
eat that much chicken. Like I just
Yeah.
I like chicken, but it's not that much.
Yeah, I think the biggest one is around muscle mass. This is what Peter Attia's new book really goes into much more detail. His book is Outlive, where
Yeah.
he talks a lot about one of the strongest correlates to longevity is muscle mass. And if you lose muscle mass, you tend to die early. And the ability to build that muscle is really reliant on having enough protein in your diet, among other things. So uh, most people, I think, get about half as much protein, if I remember the data correctly, as would be optimal. So uh, protein is one that I try to optimize for. Steps, just generally speaking, movement is one that I keep track of. It's a little bit challenging because I've noticed a trend when I'm in programming mode and I'm just writing software. I tend to get like 300 steps per day, which is really not good. And when I'm
It's like
doing
you're going from the
calls,
bedroom to to the kitchen or
yeah,
something.
exactly. It's really I average triple digit steps during programming days, which is not
uh,
not great,
not
but
good at all. Yeah.
no. But when I'm doing days where I'm taking calls, I'm doing other things, I tend to get 10 to 20,000. So it's much better on those days.
And how do you know, like, there's certain calls you're taking, like, literally audio only or something?
That's right. A lot of like say one-on-ones, if I don't feel like I need to be at my computer, I'll take a Zoom call because they're recorded, but I'll just do
Yeah.
it audio only and go for a walk.
Okay. Got it. Interesting. So you're really saying for the average person, instead of like, because everyone's tracking whether it's like VO2 max and like, 17,000 other things, and they're getting blood tests every, I have friends that are getting blood tests every month or every
hmm
3 months or something like that. You know, in some ways you're saying, okay, that just doesn't fit the 80-20 rule.
It's definitely if it's interesting to you and if that's the level of optimization that you're going for, 100% it's useful. Um, is it the challenge with a lot of these blood tests is they're useful to give you point in time measurements. This is
Yep.
there's this concept that we've talked about internally. The concept is biological observability. This is a level of depth I don't normally go into, but because you have a lot of data nerds in your audience, I think it might be useful. The This concept comes from observability theory broadly, which is the mathematical dual of control theory. And the reality is that you can't control a system unless you can observe what is going
Yep.
on in that system. And
Yep.
observability theory is about how do you observe signals coming out of a black box, assuming that you will never be able to understand the core mechanics of that system. You're just observing signals coming out of it. How do you know what is the state of what is going on in that black box. So if you imagine you're trying to model metabolic state inside of your body, but you only have like the occasional, like, oh, you took 10,000 steps today. It's like, is that really enough to know my metabolic state? Probably not. It's like, well, look, here's your glucose data. Is that enough? Probably not. How much data do you need for that? And it turns out it's a lot more than the measurement tools that we have today. And so in observability theory broadly, there are, I would say, three primitives of data: metrics, logs, and traces, which anyone who's done software development is familiar with, like a stack trace, with metrics, with adding a
Yeah.
log. These are all the same concepts, and you can apply those here, which is point in time measurements are metrics. So when you get blood work done, you have a point in time.
Yeah.
The problem,
And
as
who knows
anyone
what you
knows,
even did that morning and, whatever.
exactly.
It's like so random.
Yep, exactly. It's highly, highly variable. You can get trends over time, and you can say, in general, I can see this number is creeping up. But you can't, what you really want is a trace. You want to understand cause and effect. I
Yeah.
did this thing, which is leading to these outcomes.
I ate peanut butter and I did this, or I did this workout, or, a lot of people do monitor their sleep. That's like a common thing today where people are wearing some sort of thing to monitor their sleep. Like, how do you think about that?
Yeah, so sleep is, the way that they monitor sleep is ultimately, it's ultimately a computation based on heart rate and skin temperature and things like that. So it is really
how much
a
you're moving
downstream
or
metric.
something. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a downstream metric of the superficial metrics that the sensors pick up. So there are only so many like fundamental pieces of data that we're able to collect. And so almost all of the other things that we do around strain, around recovery, those are all derivative measurements that are just based on the same underlying data points.
Now, you're a couple of personal questions. I know you're pretty hardcore minimalist. I heard on the Tim Ferriss podcast, you said you like, I don't know if this is true, you only own like one or two pairs of pants or something. Like, how did that evolution to minimalism go there?
Yeah, I do have only one pair of pants. That's true.
So what do you do like when it's dirty? Are you just like, walking around in your undies and stuff? Or
I think one aspect is that so I have a pair of pants, I have one pair of shorts. So I'll wear the pair of shorts when I need to wash the pants. The reality is that pants don't get dirty as often as people think
I'll
they
wear
do.
a pair of pants for a whole week sometimes.
Exactly.
And sometimes my wife and my kids make fun of me, but like, I'm like, it's not that dirty. Like maybe I put a little mustard on it, but it's fine.
Yeah, exactly. I think, there's a lot of assumptions that are baked into these things of like, what if this, what if that?
Yeah.
I remember I did a long backpacking trip with a friend in China, and when we arrived, he had like 2 suitcases. He had like he had planned for every possible contingency. Like, what if we go hiking? What if we go? What if we go camping? Like, what if we end up in a mountain? What if it rains? And I brought like one small backpack with stuff, and he looked at me like I was crazy. And he was like, what if you need to do laundry? Like, he brought all the stuff to do laundry. It's like, people do laundry in China. It's like, what if we go to the ocean and we need flip-flops? It's like, people go to the ocean in China. Like, they have these things here. You don't have to bring your entire life with you all the time.
Got it. So it's just like, oh, you'll just buy it if you need to, but why have it? And okay, I'll just buy some flip-flops and maybe I'll have to throw it away, but it's better than, always traveling with those types of things.
Yeah, I think people really, it's an interesting thing because people really over-index on disposal in terms of like environmental impact, and they massively under-index on consumption. Like, people will buy useless stuff all the time. They'll buy an extra house. They'll buy this. They'll buy that.
Yeah.
The amount of the environmental impact, however you want to quantify it, of the excessive consumption is at least 1,000 times more than the pair of flip-flops that I wore for 2 weeks and then gave them away.
Yeah.
Like, it is, people just ignore the consumption aspect of it.
Is there some sort of like minimalism Laffer curve? Like, okay, too much stuff is bad, but too little, like, how do you know
Yeah.
where to go? I mean, I know that we're while we're taping this, you're like very close to having a baby,
Yeah.
first baby, which congratulations. So by the time this airs, you may have one. And I know that like once I had kids, like my stuff accumulation started going up like dramatically in my
Oh yeah,
house.
definitely.
Like how do you think about like where to like, is there some sort of heuristic to figure that out?
Yeah, I think there's the answer is there is some lower bound. Um, it is much much lower than most people think it is.
Yeah. Yep.
um, like I have one pair of pants, I have three shirts, and at some point I realized that I wasn't using one of those shirts very often, and so I
Uh-huh.
went down to two shirts, and then I realized like actually sometimes I need three shirts, and so then I have three again,
Okay.
and like turns out that was my lower bound, is
And
three
you like
shirts.
own a suit?
So yes, I have a suit. My assistant, who's based in the U.S., has my suits in her closet, and she FedExes them to me when I need them, and then I
Okay.
just send it back when I'm not using it.
Oh,
But
so you have an assistant in the US as well.
yeah,
Oh, okay, got it. Okay.
yeah.
And
So I think I
so,
have a tuxedo and I have a suit, and they're in her closet, and so she just sends it to me when I need it, and then I send it back.
okay.
I really view it as more like a
Why
costume.
not keep it in your New York City place? Like what's the value in having your suit? Because sometimes you just need it in like you're going to a wedding and you just need it there.
Yeah, it turns out it is very rare that I have a situation where I need an impromptu suit,
Yeah. Yep.
or I don't have some amount. If I don't have at least a couple days of lead time, the worst case scenario, I go to a Goodwill and I get like a jacket for $30, and then I
Yeah.
wear it to the event, and then I just give it back to them when I'm done.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
not.
Yeah.
Yeah, the overhead is not worth it for me.
Okay. I love it. Now another personal question. I know your wife, and I'm a huge fan of hers. And you went from meeting your wife to being married in like an extremely short amount of time, which I know is very rare nowadays. Maybe even in history, it's very rare. Like, beside for the fact that your wife is awesome, like what was your decision making for like being able to make that decision so quickly?
Yeah, there was actually a specific process and calculation that I did with this.
Of course there was. Yeah.
Are you familiar with the optimal stopping problem? It's a
Yeah. Of
yeah.
course. Like the N
Yep.
over E.
Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly. It was surprising for me to learn that this is actually a mathematically solved problem. Like there is a point where I think this was actually a piece of advice that I heard you give of that people generally overvalue optionality, and
Yep.
they I think don't know about the optimal stopping problem, where they think that the optimal is to wait until the end before they make a decision, but the reality is that you actually have to wait 37%.
Yeah.
That is the correct answer. And
But
so
it's hard to know what the N is. Like it's 30%. Like, do you have to date 100 people? Do you have to date three people? Do you have to date, like,
yeah,
it's hard to know like what the N is, right?
totally. And you can actually, since time is finite, you can do the math on this. If you say something like, all
I
right,
want to be married by 35 years old or something,
mhm,
and I can only date X number of people during
yep,
that time. Okay.
yep. It's like I can only date X number of people during that time. And you say the N is, all right, turns out the N is 60, which is actually a lot more finite than you realize.
Okay. So
And
that
then,
basically
yeah,
means by like after does that mean you have to date, because in the optimal problem then you would
yeah,
have to date 22 people, decide specifically you're not going to marry any of them, which is kind of weird for them, and then you marry the best one you meet after that or something, right?
yeah. That would be in the like mathematically optimal case.
Yeah.
I think in my case, it was more like doing the math made me realize that I was already past the 37% mark.
Mhm.
And so like my I'm running out of time in my life to make this a reality. And so
Mhm.
on each of my first dates, I would tell people that my goal is to either be married within 6 months or to have broken this off. And uh, some of my dates ended on the spot, which is, you know,
Reasonable. Yeah.
yeah, reasonable. and others thought that that was a reasonable approach. So it's it's a matching problem, not a sales problem.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so, and did you have like a list of things or something that you were okay? Okay, I
Hmm.
have this criteria, and basically, if you hit like 8 of the 16 criteria, like I'm going to propose to you, and hopefully you'll say yes, kind of thing, or
Yeah, so I put together a one pager of what I was looking for in a partner, and I usually shared it on either the first or second date.
Mhm.
And this was another one of those things where sometimes they would read it and say, "This is definitely not me."
Yeah,
Like one of the first things I had in there was that open mindedness is something that I've learned is very important to me. I said I need somebody who can be friends with a Biden voter and a Trump voter.
Mhm.
Whether you agree with either of them, it doesn't matter, but you have to be able to be civil and have a conversation and recognize that there are things to learn from everybody. And sometimes people would look at that and just say, "This is not me. Like
Yeah.
I could not do that." And that's okay. Some of those I'm actually still friends with, and they come to my salon dinners, but like it just would not have been a good match long term. Um, the uh, the specific example for Vario, my wife, was I showed her the one pager on our first date, and then on our second date, she showed me her spreadsheet that she had made with 64 points of what she was looking for, and I realized like, oh, that was a first. So that was a sign.
Now, do you? I assume in like some of those, like maybe that particular one was a kind of a deal breaker thing, and somehow you knew that that was a deal breaker, whereas maybe you have other criteria that were kind of like definitely pluses. Or maybe other ones that were like kind of negatives, but they weren't deal breakers. And you're not going to get someone if you have like 20 things, no one's going to hit all 20, right?
Right.
So how did you know like okay, these were the deal breakers and these were the less, the kind of nice to haves or something? Like maybe you don't want
Yeah.
to marry a smoker, but like if they're great and just happen to smoke, okay, you'll still marry them or something.
Yeah. I did a lot of reflecting and I wrote down a lot of things and I spent some time with friends to help consolidate some of these ideas. I ended up with 6 things that were really the only deal breakers.
Okay, so you have to have all 6 of these
Yep.
things. Okay.
Yep.
And then like but I can imagine even with 6, it's hard for someone to have all 6, or at least, maybe they're like 50 or 60% of the way there on some of them, but they're not
Right.
100% of the way there.
Yep, for sure. Yeah, and so there's always compromise at each stage. I think
Yeah.
the reality is this ties into the optimal stopping problem, which is I have enough exposure to the world to know how likely is it that the next person that I meet is going to be at 100% for all of these things,
Yeah.
and just being able to this ties into recognizing that I can continue to expand my options indefinitely and then I die. So at some point you've got to
Yeah.
stop and you have to make a decision.
Okay. All right. This is awesome. Now you and I are both huge fans of throwing dinner parties around one topic of conversation. We've been to each other's dinner parties. Um, and I've learned a lot from your dinner parties. Like, how do your dinners work, and what are some of the best practices you think for throwing a dinner party?
Yeah, so I've been hosting these for years. I've done well over 100 of them. I think there were a lot of lessons learned. I think one of the biggest ones that's probably the simplest to implement is that the size of the group matters a lot. Um, I think 6 to 8 is probably the optimal number if
Mm-hmm.
everyone is really engaged.
So it means you kind of have to invite like 10, and then some no shows happen.
Yep, that's exactly right. There's some I usually invite 10 to 12. I try to aim to have 10 people because you can't always guarantee
Yeah.
that every person will be super like
Engaged.
engaged. So you tend to end up with that number of people is kind of best. I've tried increasing it to 14, 20 people and it's just does not work. It's just way, way too many people to have a single conversation at the
And
table.
you're the facilitator at your own dinners, right? So you're making sure like
Hmm.
you need to have like a real facilitator who knows how to facilitate the conversations.
Totally. And I would say that I'm a pretty ruthless moderator. The I've experimented with a lot of different things. I've tried to let the conversation just flow in whatever direction it's going to go. But the reality is people all came there for the topic that was scheduled. And so if you end up going in these random tangents, nobody's happy.
Yeah.
And so pulling the conversation, always trying to find ways to pull the conversation back to the topic at hand is really important. Being mindful of conversation monopolizers is another one to just be aware of, and try to make sure that the people who are quiet, trying to find ways to engage them and bring them into the conversation. So just calling on those people. I think one of the other, that's just another fundamental aspect of hosting these dinners, is I've tried hosting dinners on topics that I was optimistically interested in,
Yeah.
but didn't actually care about. And every time I've done those, they've fallen flat.
So
Fundamentally,
you have to personally be super interested in them.
yeah, that's right.
Now, how do you like, I know for some people when I go to their dinners, like they let everyone know who's going to the dinner ahead of time.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are other dinners where it's kind of like you just have to show up, and then so they're going on some sort of faith of who's like, how do you think of one versus the other?
Yeah, I would say it's highly relevant to the intent of the dinner. So like I host about once a month, I do founder dinners, which is only founders talking about like the real hard things that founders go through that they can't talk about with anybody else. And for those dinners, you say who you are, what your company does, how many employees you have, because that's the most relevant thing for everyone else to know.
But do people know about that even before they show up? Like, do they have they get a list of, okay, Jane and Bobby are both coming to the, okay.
Yep. But also it's useful in the intros just to set context, because it's relevant for you to know, is this other person in the same category as me? How many employees do they have? How is that relevant to the problems that they're experiencing? In the salon dinners, I try to keep it as low key as possible, which is usually just your name and the last book you read. Those are the two things that I have people say, because if it turns into like a status competition, which certain people who went to certain Ivy League schools seem to have a problem following those rules. But if you just keep it to your name and the last book you read, it sets everyone on the same playing field, where you can have really experiential conversations about people's life and their history, and you don't have to measure them based on like how they compare to other people in the group.
So what if people want to connect afterwards? Are after the dinner, you say, okay, by the way, here's the people who went, like you should reach out, or how do you do that?
Yeah. I mean, people have the list. They're on the calendar invites. You could, if you wanted to do your research, you could figure out who everyone was.
Okay, got it. You can see who's coming on the calendar, and you can jump in, and you could email them or something 100%. If you want to, and say, hey, Bobby, like you were so interesting. I'd love to connect or something.
Yeah, and my EAs at the end of the dinner send a follow-up to everyone saying like, thanks everyone for coming. Wait. My EAs at the end of the event send a follow-up to everyone and say, thanks everyone for coming. Here's everyone's email address, connecting everyone here for follow-ups. And so they do have access to it. It's really just about level setting in the space that we're in.
Okay. Two last questions. One is, what is a conspiracy theory that you believe?
I don't know what the specifics are of this conspiracy, but I'm confident that it's real. There's something going on with insulin prices in the United States. And I don't know who is behind the conspiracy.
So the prices are super high?
The prices, it is a thing that has been off patent for going on 100 years now, and prices keep going up. And that should not be the case. It seems like nothing else follows this pattern, but for whatever reason, insulin prices keep going up, at least in the US.
And that's not true in other countries or something? Or
this is a United States phenomenon.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like insulin prices, I think insulin was discovered maybe 80 years ago. It's been a long time. And yet the prices continue to go up.
There's only one manufacturer of it, or are there many different?
There's a few.
Okay.
There's just a small handful of them.
Maybe they've got like somehow they keep they have some sort of price conspiracy or something.
What I've read about this, it seems like a major abuse of patent law seems to be the reason why these prices continue to go up. But yeah, it's the outcome defies what I think should be happening in this.
Okay.
And so
Like,
I
should
feel
you and I
confident.
get in the insulin business and start like, coming up with putting things out at 10x the cost, 10,
Yeah, 1/10 the cost.
1/10 the
There
cost.
are
Yeah.
people working on that right now.
Okay.
And like it's totally plausible.
All right. Awesome. Last question we ask all of our guests: what conventional wisdom or advice do you think is generally bad advice?
I think one, especially for younger people, which I've seen the consequence of this, is people say work smarter, not harder. And I think it's bad advice because the correct answer is work smarter and harder. I think most people don't work hard enough in general. And so saying that they don't need to work as hard, they just need to work smarter is just wrong. There's to deliver really incredible value, especially in a startup, you're not getting there on a 9 to 5. It's going to require a lot of effort, but you also should work smarter. So I would say it's generally bad advice.
Okay. Yeah, I would 100% agree with that. Is certainly, at least in my experience, like the best people I've ever worked with are highly correlated to those who worked
Yeah, exactly.
the most number of hours.
Yeah.
But sometimes I think like maybe I was ultimately better able to motivate them for whatever reason than I was somebody else. And so it's not clear, like maybe they were the best, not only because they worked the most hours, but just they were just more passionate about that particular, or I don't
Yep.
know how to correlate these things somehow.
Yeah, for sure.
Like, I don't know that like someone, if you're not passionate, you said like at the dinner party, like if you didn't like it in the first place, like you can't, like if you weren't passionate, like it's hard to motivate working those kind of like really hard hours.
Yeah, I mean, some people like what they do for work. Some people don't. I find myself just incredibly fortunate that my hobby is writing software. It just happens to be a thing that industry values. If the thing that I liked doing was playing guitar, I would have a much harder time with it. But I'm just very lucky that the thing that I do for fun is also something that is beneficial financially.
Okay, this has been awesome. Thank you, Sam Corcos, for joining us on World of DaaS. I follow you at Sam Corcos on Twitter or X or whatever we call it. And I definitely encourage our listeners to engage with you there. This has been a ton of fun.
Awesome. Thanks, Auren.